PBT station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Over the last decade, Eastern Airlines has been at war with itself.
I live and breathe fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
For a brief period, management and the unions made peace.
Everyone was working together.
But the truce was broken, and Eastern was taken over by Frank Lorenzo, who is now dismantling the airline.
The sale today is not our preferred course.
Tonight on Frontline, the battle for Eastern Airlines.
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Judy Woodruff.
Good evening. Last fall, when Eastern Airlines owner Frank Lorenzo sold the Eastern Shuttle to Donald Trump, it struck many as the death knell of the company. The sale of Eastern's most profitable asset was only the latest move in Lorenzo's strategy to keep the airline flying. But one Wall Street analyst observed recently that Eastern may have already reached the point of no return. Tonight, Frontline examines the long descent of America's third largest airline and the bitter struggle for control of its future. Our program was produced by Alex Gibney. The correspondent is Robert Kuttner. It is called The Battle for Eastern Airlines.
For more than 10 years, a battle has been raging at Eastern Airlines between workers and managers. On one level, the battle has engaged three men: an astronaut, a corporate raider, and a union leader, each with a different vision of how to save the company. One believed in technology, one in the power of finance, and one in the power of labor. In companies all over the country, this same battle of conflicting visions is shaping our economic future. But today at Eastern, rapidly losing passengers and money, it is a battle for survival. It is a bitter irony that only 4 years ago, labor and management at Eastern built America's most far-reaching model of workplace cooperation. The promise and the failure of that partnership at Eastern tells a story of America's economic dilemma. In the face of increasing international competition, can American workers and managers find new ways to escape their old adversarial traditions? That question has haunted Eastern Airlines, where, in the worst of times, those conflicts were known as the wars.
I live and breathe fighting management and Eastern Airlines.
I remember terminating 4 people in a day. That was how callous we were.
Wars in the sense that equipment would have a tendency to take off by itself. Engines would blow up because they didn't have oil in it.
We always thought they needed to be terminated. We felt that it was, enforcing the rules, and rules made this corporation run properly.
We sat around and looked at the engine for 8 hours. If I did an hour's work in 1981, I guess I was pushing it.
Constantly, we were at each other's throats, whether it was over table in arbitration, whether it was over table in a grievance, whether it was down on the floor. You had to look at the culture of this corporation to know that the only success you as a person were going to find was by being the meanest, nastiest, toughest guy in the block and being successful in terms of your win-loss record and what you did.
Eastern Airlines was born in 1926 to carry mail between New York and Atlanta for $3 a pound. The World War I flying ace, Eddie Rickenbacker, bought Eastern in 1938 and ran it until 1963. Labor relations were not his strong suit. Rickenbacker was known as the captain. He referred to his workers as privates. To Rickenbacker, Eastern was a corporate army waging war on its competitors. But at Eastern, the biggest battles were waged inside the company. From 1935 to the mid-60s, Eastern endured scores of strikes and slowdowns. The company survived because of airline regulation. Until 1978, the government's Civil Aeronautics Board told airlines what routes to fly and how much they could charge. These regulated fares guaranteed management enough income to give workers regular wage increases.
If management capitulated to labor, allowed labor costs to increase, those costs would just be reflected in higher prices, regulated prices. All the airlines would have higher regulated prices. The cost would simply be passed on to consumers. And hence, an underlying labor management conflict was kept under the wraps, at least for a time.
In 1968, the world knew Frank Borman as the man who led the Apollo 8 mission around the moon.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, God bless all of you on the good earth.
Back on Earth, in 1975, Eastern Airlines Board of Directors judged Borman to have the right stuff to lead Eastern out of the darkness. Personal authority was always important to Borman. When he assumed command of the airline, Borman's nickname, earned at NASA, was the Colonel. At Eastern, he was like a field commander.
No, I don't see any 182s. There's 192.
He abolished executive perks, drove to work in a second-hand Chevy. He even helped his troops unload baggage. Borman was trained to believe in a military chain of command. Educated at West Point and the Harvard Business School, Borman was willing to share sacrifice, but not authority.
It was a simple matter of a few people at the top making all the orders, taking all the initiative, and most people at the bottom simply following directions.
As a military man, Borman believed he could handle his troops. As a NASA man, he was convinced that faith in the machine would lead to Eastern's salvation. Borman's solution was bigger and better planes. He bought 25 A300s and 27 Boeing 757s, the largest block purchase in the history of the industry. Buying the fuel-efficient planes was a gamble based on rising fuel costs, but the gamble backfired on Borman when fuel prices dropped. Soon, Eastern's debt had soared to $2.5 billion, the same price as the Apollo 8 mission to the moon.
I want as far away from the smoking as I can get.
In a regulated environment, Eastern could have passed these costs on to the consumer. But when economic conditions changed, Eastern had to lower ticket prices, even while its debt kept rising. In 1978, deregulation came to the airline industry. Over 100 new non-union carriers like People Express flew into the marketplace with low labor costs and cut-rate tickets. Older airlines, tied to high-priced union contracts, often had to fly at a loss in order to compete.
We were faced with People's Express, whose labor costs were about 40% of ours. Continental, whose labor costs were about 50% of ours. Our strategy was clear. We wanted to fix it, and that meant lowering labor costs.
When Eastern tried to compete by cutting wages, a bitter war broke out between Eastern and its three unions: the pilots, the flight attendants, and the machinists. By the early 1980s, labor and management faced the destruction of the company and the jobs of its 40,000 employees. But the response of both sides was to dig in and fight harder. In the trenches of the Miami machine shops, workers' slowdowns ate away at the company's efficiency. In response, Eastern hired reinforcements, supervisors whose only job was to watch and discipline the machinists. They hid behind two-way mirrors. They huddled inside jet engine cowlings, spying on workers with binoculars. Some mechanics struck back by sabotaging machines they were supposed to repair. When managers tried to boost output by enforcing the rules, workers fought back in the most destructive way possible. They followed the rules to the letter.
Okay, Hank, take your end toward the south. We started at 7:30. This engine is basically done as soon as the electrician gets done, right? Hour and a half. I can go in there and pull the maintenance manual out, and there's a manual in there that thick to change this engine, right? I can take 2 days to change this engine, right? So basically, that's what we were doing. I was one of the people that was more, shall we say, aggressive at it, right? Because I was protecting, in other words, I was like an old groundhog digging in his hole. I was protecting my hole.
All the planes were going out late. There was no engines coming out of the engine shop. It was a constant state of war. I really thought that was going to be the end of Eastern Airlines.
Eastern was a house divided against itself. While labor and management were busy fighting each other, competitors zeroed in on the troubled company. In 1981, Eastern lost $65 million. In 1982, $75 million. By 1983, the company's losses soared to $183 million. Only a year before, Braniff's sudden bankruptcy showed where Eastern might be headed.
It's a shock to them, I know. There is no payroll. They were taken off the payroll as of last night. The payroll, the checks that are out there now will not go through. There is no cash to support them.
Then, in September 1983, Continental Airlines, led by its tough chief executive, Frank Lorenzo, declared bankruptcy, citing high labor costs.
Our action today is to reorganize these assets in order to create a low-cost competitive carrier.
We want a contract, not a union bus.
Continental infuriated labor groups around the country when it used Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Code to void its high-priced union contracts. Lorenzo fired 8,000 workers and cut the wages of his remaining employees in half. 2 days later, it was Eastern's turn.
Hello, I'm Frank Borman, and I'm recording this on Sunday evening. It's a little bit past 8:30 now, almost 26 hours since Continental ceased operation.
In a videotape broadcast to Eastern employees, Frank Borman presented some grim alternatives for the troubled airline. The first was to shut the company down like Braniff.
Second course of action is to file for protection under Chapter 11 of the Bankruptcy Act, a la Continental. See if we could continue to operate. It would certainly have to be under vastly different circumstances, as Continental employees are finding out.
Borman's third alternative was 20% pay cuts for all of Eastern's employees.
Borman's gotta go.
But after a history of angry battles over wage concessions, all three unions refused.
What happens if Borman's telling the truth and next week you're out of a job?
Borman is creating the situation. Anybody can drive a company down a tube.
And I want you to understand, with all of the honesty that I can muster in your eyes, that in my estimation, you will be voting on your jobs. Thank you very much, and God bless you all. It's like your children. You can have a genuine concern for your children. You want the best for them, but sometimes you have to ask them to do things that they really don't want to do. You can't have that extra ice cream cone, or you're going to have to go to bed when the time. It's very difficult to make those kind of decisions with a group who may not understand directly the rationale for those decisions, as you can tell a child, but your decisions in this case are filtered through an individual, i.e. a labor leader, who is more interested in keeping the children happy than he is in their health.
That labor leader was Charlie Bryan. In 1968, while Frank Borman was orbiting the moon, Charlie Bryan was tuning jet engines on the ground as an Eastern line mechanic.
I wanted to come over and look over the operation here. I heard that...
Bryan rose to power by working his way up the union hierarchy. He was elected president of the Machinists Union at Eastern in 1980 on a platform to end the wage concessions that had been going on at Eastern since 1975.
Appreciate everything everybody's doing out here.
We got the actual number of hours.
By late in 1983, Borman's call for wage cuts put Bryan in a bind. As a union leader, his job was to get more for his members, not less. But without wage cuts, Bryan knew the company would go under.
That repeats itself. The other ones that are
He searched for a new solution, something he could demand in exchange for concessions.
Yesterday presented our numbers. Okay.
All of my life, I have had a feeling that employees of companies are truly owners of the company that they work for. They, in the course of their labor and working for that company, they're investing their life, their intellect, and their muscle and their ability. And in exchange for that, I've always felt that there should be an ownership that goes beyond just having the job. There should be a true ownership. The company started asking the employees to voluntarily reduce wages and take pay freezes and so forth. It began in 1975. In 1980, immediately after becoming president of the union, I went to a stockholders meeting and pointed out that the employees had donated enough wages to have bought every single share of voting stock at Eastern Airlines. They could have purchased the entire corporation and completely owned 100% of their own company. And yet they had not received one single share of stock for all that investment of wages. And it was the old scenario of taxation without representation as far as we were concerned.
Late in the fall of 1983, the machinists proposed a bold new plan. Wage cuts in exchange for a financial stake in Eastern and a say in the management of the company. The plan would put the unions in a most unusual position of responsibility.
We come up with a very, very innovative, progressive plan for sharing codetermination, governance of the airline, and board positions and so forth. We presented that to Borman. It included 25% ownership of all the voting stock. His reaction to that was, I'm not going to have the monkeys running a zoo. He did not like the idea, and he rejected it.
But toward the end of the year, Borman faced the prospect of default on Eastern's loans. The airline's banks, who held the company's $2.5 billion debt, pressured Borman to accept Bryan's radical new proposal. So did Eastern's labor negotiator, former Labor Secretary William Ussery. Facing the prospect of a strike, the growing loss of consumer confidence, and possible bankruptcy or liquidation, Borman caved in. On December 13, 1983, Ussery, flanked by Bryan and Borman, announced Eastern's revolutionary labor pact. The deal was a trade, wage cuts for a stake and a say in the management of the airline. Eastern got pay cuts worth $292 million, increased productivity worth $75 million, and changes in archaic union work rules. The employees got 25% of Eastern's common stock, 4 seats on the board of directors, including one for Bryan, access to the company books, and the right to determine the way work is done. The machinists later won the opportunity to buy back their wage cuts by finding ways to save the company money. The radical worker ownership plan inspired a new marketing campaign.
You're looking at the new owners of Eastern Airline. 37,000 employees of Eastern are now stockholders, each with a personal investment in how Eastern performs.
So we'll be working even harder.
Moving even faster.
Going even farther.
To serve you even better.
And we've got what it takes to do it. Earning our wings every day. That's not just a slogan, it's a commitment from the owners.
At Eastern, we earn our wings every day.
Eastern represented an historic first. That Eastern deal brought labor and management together as partners in enterprise. Labor and management working together to run the enterprise, not just to share the profits, but also to decide how best to make that airline work.
Many of the other business executives that I've talked to have told me flat out that they would rather have shut the company down than make the accommodation with the unions that we've made. And many of the traditional business leaders in the U.S. find this mode of management very threatening to them. I can understand why. You, in essence, surrender some of the authority to the group.
Eastern's new agreement was a complete turnabout from the company's old military tradition. At Boston's Logan Airport, Eastern eliminated all of its low-level ramp supervisors and let the workers run the field themselves.
In 1982 and some of 83, we had no say, we had no decisions to make. We weren't allowed to use our God-given brain, and it's a lot different now People like to come to work. They like making decisions. And take, for example, today, we have no managers on today. We have no station manager. We have no shift managers. Eastern today in Boston on the day shift is run totally by the leads. We have no supervision, and apparently there's no need for it.
Time cards were abolished in Boston, and on-time attendance improved. The machinists relaxed old work rules. Ramp crews pitched in to do whatever was necessary to get the planes in and out and the baggage moved. During the wars, such commitment from workers would have been unthinkable.
We had 5 management people watching 3 Union troops unload an airplane. And it was aggravating. We felt that they didn't think we could do our job. They're always overseeing us like little kids. We run the show now, and we're doing a better job, and the company's making more money.
After the reduction in supervision, Chief Steward Leo Romano and the union assumed many management responsibilities. They helped prepare bids for charter flights, organized the shift schedules and vacations, supervised overtime, and assigned personnel to meet the flights.
Just in case.
3 years ago, I was ready to quit. I was only 39 years old at the time. I got 4 kids at home, and every day I'd come in here and I'd listen to the money problems of Eastern Airlines. They want a piece of our check and all that, you know, and the paychecks were starting to get smaller. So I talked it over with my wife, and I was actually ready to quit Eastern Airlines until these meetings with the union started taking place, and Charlie Bryan negotiated a contract where we became part of the airline itself. Instead of just a number anymore, it's my airline. I feel like anybody that almost goes to work in their own shop and stuff, it's mine. Eastern Airlines is mine. And the more I do for Eastern Airlines, the better off it is for me.
The new agreement fostered a system of shop floor entrepreneurship. Machinists could buy back their wage cuts by inventing ways to improve productivity and by ferreting out waste throughout the company. The agreement also empowered the machinists to bring any work done by outside contractors back in-house, provided they could do it more cheaply. That saved money and jobs.
But to show you one way that we were being ripped off was this little filter right here goes on an aircraft. We were paying $24 for that filter. We found that we could buy it for 2.5 cents.
The company had ideas of how to run this department, and they didn't use their best attribute, which is the mechanic. Well, now if we can show them how we save money, it was $158 a man-hour to build the CF6 engine. We're down to 78 now. And as we find new ways to do things, we can implement them automatically.
In my opinion, I've never seen the company humming like it was. I mean, the fellows were eager to work. God, I got 50 phone calls a day on, come over here and help me do this or figure this or show me what you want done.
For 2 years, Eastern's program of labor management cooperation was a success story. Newly motivated mechanics, executives, pilots, and flight attendants invented ways to save the company over $100 million. For the first 2 quarters of 1985, Eastern soared to the biggest profits in the company's history. By September, the airline was flying towards $73 million in the black.
I would like to sit here and say that the reason we have probably the most advanced employee involvement program in the airline, or maybe in American industry, is because both the management and union were enlightened enough to perceive this as the wave of the future. I think we have it because we were faced with the prospects of financial disaster, and this looked like a way out.
But in the fall of 1985, a new financial crisis sent Eastern into a tailspin. New fare wars forced Eastern to cut ticket prices below costs. A fourth quarter loss of $67 million all but wiped out the profits from the rest of the year. Cooperation proved as fragile as the company's bottom line. Eastern's high debt and low-cost competition denied labor and management the time to revise their old roles.
In American industry, there is a deep cultural resistance to power sharing, not only on the part of management, but also on the part of labor. Management is used to being in control. Labor is used to taking direction. It's a little bit threatening for management to lose complete control. It's a little bit threatening for labor to have that much responsibility. These are not the roles they've inherited.
When the financial crunch came to Eastern, both sides reverted to type. Labor blamed the airline's problems on bad management. Management blamed everything on high wages.
They were obsessed with this idea of reducing the rate of pay. They would not listen to what I kept trying to say. We want to reduce labor cost and do it through productivity and efficiencies. And we proved it, we could do it. They even validated it.
A lot of labor ideas were that they would come in and be involved in making the major decisions on equipment and how you schedule the airline, how you market the airline, and so on. And of course, our idea was, well, you know, we want their cooperation, and how do you do your job better? How do we cut the costs in the workplace? But you have to have an understanding in a corporation that management has to manage. And we may have gone too far as a management in our enthusiasm to elicit the cooperation. We may have paid too high a price for it.
By early in 1986, a management consultant recommended that Eastern declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy to void its union contracts. Meanwhile, Eastern's banks, which held the airline's $2.5 billion debt, threatened to throw the company into default unless all employees agreed to 20% wage cuts by February 24th. As the deadline approached, a new player entered the game.
Toward the end of February, about the 20th, there was a board meeting, and they said they were going to look for someone to buy Eastern if they couldn't fix it through reducing and cutting wage rates and so forth. The following day, they called the labor groups together, that was on Saturday, and said that they had found a buyer, an interested buyer, and the deadline was midnight Sunday, the 23rd. We all knew that it was Lorenzo, but they had not said who it was.
Since declaring Chapter 11 at Continental, Frank Lorenzo had expanded his empire. His holding company, Texas Air, now owned both the resurgent Continental and New York Air.
Any changes at
Eastern's management had approached Lorenzo in part because the unions feared his hardball tactics. The idea, said one board member, was a pincer play to make Eastern's unions choose between wage cuts and Frank Lorenzo.
The unions call you a union buster. Do you plan to reopen all their contracts when you take over? We're airline builders and not union busters.
On the weekend of February 21st, 1986, Eastern's board of directors met to decide the fate of the airline. On Sunday night, Eastern reached tentative accords with the pilots and the flight attendants. That left Charlie Bryan and the machinists.
At about 11:30, Borman turned to me and said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I've made my position clear. I have told you we will save this company money, but we're not going to keep reducing our wage rates to subsidize what's going on in this corporation. He said, you're going to be the one that caused the sale of Eastern Airlines. I'm going to tell the world that you caused the sale of Eastern Airlines. And I said, well, I'm going to tell them you did it, so what does that prove? The meeting went on until about 1 o'clock in the morning, and a motion was on the floor to sell Eastern Airlines to Texas Air Corporation. That was totally unacceptable as far as I was concerned. This whole culture we had worked so hard to create was being destroyed. I went out and talked to the two lawyers that we had available on the scene there to advise us and told them that, number one, I would not open our contract, but I would consider a reduction in the rates of pay by 15% more if we had the right to have a new chairman of the company which was acceptable to all the workforce, all the employees.
Well, I offered to resign. As you know, one of the machinist union's conditions were that if they would give a 15% pay cut, if indeed I would resign. And obviously I offered to do that, and the board rejected it.
They protected their chairman, and they went ahead with the sale. 4 people representing the employees voted against it. All the other board members voted for the sale of Eastern Airlines to Texas Air Corporation. It was about 2:45 on Monday morning, February the 24th.
The deal forced the sale of all of Eastern's common stock to Frank Lorenzo. The workers received $10 a share, but without stock, they lost their stake and their say in the airline. The era of cooperation was over.
I sent a very warm telegram to Frank Lorenzo the next day, suggesting that he and I meet and continue working together to produce the best product and the best service and run the company the way we knew it could be run. And he never answered that telegram. That was sent to him on the morning after the sale. He never responded.
Only a few months after the sale, Lorenzo's new management team laid off 2,000 employees and threatened 50% pay cuts. Brian was stripped of his position on the board of directors and banned from Eastern property. In a union bulletin, he told his membership, "We're back in the midst of an all-out war."
I think management now can make a rational approach to labor, one that makes sense from the standpoint of the company. If it's not successful, they have an arsenal. They can take a strike and they can win a strike. Look at TWA. Look at the incredible stupidity of the flight attendants on TWA. The world has changed. The marketplace rules. And the American labor movement refuses to accept that. And they're going to pay a terrible price for it.
2 days after this interview, Frank Borman resigned from Eastern Airlines. Frank Lorenzo gave Borman $1 million to serve on the board of Texas Air. Borman then retreated to Las Cruces, New Mexico, to be near his son and write a book about his life. Borman's departure did not end the labor wars at Eastern, but his leaving symbolized a new trend in American business. Managers like Borman, who believed in the power of technology, were being supplanted by men who believed in the power of money. In the 1980s, there was a dramatic rise in corporate takeovers led by men called raiders. Using high-interest loans called junk bonds, they bought troubled companies and then cut wages or sold off pieces to pay back their debts. This new era of finance sparked the success of a man who was to remake the airline industry.
If I were you, I wouldn't believe a word I'm about to say. Instead, let the facts, not just my words, speak for themselves.
And we'll have fun.
The facts are that Lorenzo's company, Texas Air, is the biggest airline in the Western world. It is an $8.5 billion empire with 600 planes and control of 20% of the U.S. market. Lorenzo built Texas Air by understanding the challenges of deregulation.
Under deregulation, airlines were thrown into the marketplace. And where now you had a fight. You had a fight for airplanes. You had a fight for routes. You had a fight for the market, but you had a fight for passengers. The passenger now was king.
Well, you can forget about all that now.
To serve the passenger, Lorenzo built his airlines around a simple marketing strategy, low fares. But to supply low fares to travelers, Lorenzo demanded low wages for workers. This would lead to inevitable conflicts with airline labor unions. Lorenzo assembled his empire by making savvy deals for troubled companies deep in debt. In 1971, he bought tiny Texas International, whose shoddy service had earned it the nickname Teeter-Totter Airlines. To make it profitable, Lorenzo moved to cut labor costs, and the unions went on strike.
The strike is going to cost us millions of dollars.
Lorenzo grounded the airline for 4 months to break the strike, and he got his low labor costs. In 1981, it worked again. In a bitter takeover battle, little Texas International borrowed enough money to buy the much larger Continental. To pay back debts and make the company profitable, Lorenzo sold planes and asked for wage cuts. When the unions refused to give them, Lorenzo declared Chapter 11.
It was either fix it, sell it, or merge it. Since we couldn't fix it, we merged it, and we're very pleased with it.
With Eastern, Lorenzo got his biggest bargain. The price was $620 million, a steal for an airline Eastern size. The payment plan was even better. $340 million to be paid by Eastern's future revenues. Lorenzo persuaded Eastern to borrow more than half the money to finance its own sale.
It was a terrific deal. All of that put the unions ultimately in the crosshairs, if you will, of the Texas Air guns, because the Eastern Airlines that Frank Lorenzo acquired was highly leveraged.
Leverage means debt. More debt for Eastern meant greater pressure to cut costs.
Eastern has more debt than some of its competitors, so therefore the labor area is the only area where Eastern really has an opportunity for reasonable relief in order to try to level the playing field.
Eastern's labor costs are below the industry average, but its debt is so high the airline needs dramatically lower wages. In fact, by 1988, if every machinist took 50% pay cuts, the company would still run in the red.
He wants us to foot the bill on the debt. I've got over 25 years there, and he wants us to take a 50% cut in pay, so that would be down to about $8 an hour. And I have children that, teenagers now working for almost that still live at home and they have no bills and stuff like that compared to what I have with 4 children and, you know, mortgage. I just couldn't afford it.
And they'll never be satisfied. It's just the reverse of what unions used to be identified with 50 to 75 years ago, and the old famous saying about the unions want more. Well, it's the reverse of that now. The management wants more, and there's no end to it. There's never enough.
What we have been steadily confronted with are some union leaders who are anti-company, and it's very obvious that they've been anti-company. Their goal has been to try to bring down Texas Air because Texas Air is one of the last forces of competition in the marketplace. They would like to keep having this nice, cozy environment without anybody that ruffles up the waters here and puts any pressure on wage rates and in term fares over time in this industry. We're perceived as a threat.
Today, with chronic pressure for wage cuts, cooperation at Eastern is impossible. The conflict between the company and the IAM is especially bitter. No TV cameras are allowed into machinist areas except the surveillance units installed by the company to watch the workers. In Miami, the last vestige of the days of cooperation, the machinists' cost-saving team has been kicked off Eastern property. Now, in the union hall across the street, the team clings to its contractual right to prove that Eastern can cut costs rather than wages.
That's 200. They're showing 195 here.
No, that's the groups you got your...
Yeah, that's your groups 1 through...
Each section of the engine is a group.
Since Frank Lorenzo bought the airline in early '86, the company's completely ignored us. We've got over probably $7 million in cost-saving benefits and reports sitting on the division controller's desk. They completely ignored. I sent them letter after letter after letter to them, and they won't acknowledge my letters. And I find it frustrating because they're asking for 20 to 40% cuts from us right now. They need the money, but they won't even implement or even evaluate the cost savings that we've given them so far.
In 1985, Buddy Sugg was a key member of the cost savings team. Now he does nothing but process grievances against the company.
In 1985, it was kind of kiss and get along, and we were trying to restore the wages. They fired 36 people in 1985, total year. In 1986, which Mr. Lorenzo took over in February of 1986, from February to December 31st, 1986, they fired 363 people. So, you know, that's quite a jump. 1987, they fired 295. So far this year, which is November of 1988, they fired 194.
The policies themselves were designed to do just what they did, which was to put membership of unions on the street, to put the fear of God into employees, and to basically destabilize the company.
Jeff Callahan used to be on the management side of Eastern's labor wars.
Smile.
Today, he is in private practice, representing many employees whom he believes have been unjustly fired by Eastern.
The way they were treating the employees, the things they were doing to the corporation were things that I just could not agree with. It's unquestionable in my mind that they came in with the predetermined idea of putting the IAM out on strike, or putting the unions out on strike.
The IAM resisted a strike. Instead, they and the other unions went public with their grievances, claiming that Eastern was not properly run and that the safety and solvency of the airline were threatened.
The big lie technique centered around a couple of notions. One is we're a bunch of robber barons trying to destroy the company. Two, we are anti-employee and trying to destroy human lives. And number three, the airline is unsafe, and we're running the company in a way that jeopardizes safety margins. Now, those three themes are themes that are going to get attention. PBS is going to come and do stories on companies that have those charges made against them.
Pressured by a public outcry, the Department of Transportation investigated safety and management practices at Eastern. The government found no major safety problems, but gave the company a warning.
In a company so divided, the risk is increased that the labor management discord will, at some time, either through inattention or design, have an adverse impact on the public safety.
The bad publicity scared passengers away from Eastern and the other Texas air carrier, Continental. In 1987, Eastern lost $181 million. Continental lost $258 million. As both carriers burned up cash, management blamed labor and labor blamed management, especially Frank Lorenzo.
There's a document that we weren't aware of and discovered by accident during the course of all the litigation we've been involved in, where the unions had a meeting and set out a written plan to make Frank Lorenzo the issue, describe him as the pillager of the American dream, get a lot of public and media attention by personalizing the issue.
The unions were joined by other critics who discovered disturbing things about the makeup of the Lorenzo empire. Farrell Cooper Smith once testified on behalf of Lorenzo when Continental used Chapter 11 to void its union contracts. Today, he represents the pilots' union at Eastern.
Recognizing that we had been on the other side of the Continental matter, also recognizing that my firm, I would say proudly, is pro-business. We represent corporate America. I don't think we switch sides because I think we're still on the side of the system. And I think it's in the system's best interest to not allow it to be abused and used as a weapon, which is what we think is happening here at Eastern. It's a very clever corporate raid where the unionized airline is being dismantled for the benefit of the non-union carrier and for the interest of the holding company.
Today, the Texas Air conglomerate owes lenders $5.4 billion. Most of that debt belongs to Eastern and Continental. Texas Air also borrows money on its own. In theory, Texas Air should pay its debts with the profits from its airlines. But there are no profits at Eastern and Continental, so Texas Air looks for other ways to pull up cash. Critics call this upstreaming. For example, Texas Air charges Eastern $15 million a year for a management fee. Eastern used to buy its own fuel. Now Texas Air buys fuel for Eastern. For that service, Eastern pays Texas Air a penny per gallon for a total of $13 million a year. And Eastern has loaned Continental and Texas Air $220 million at low interest rates, and then borrowed $200 million from banks at high interest rates.
The problem is when one removes money and valuable property from your operating companies who aren't able to pay dividends because they're already not successful and not earning money, it takes those weakened operating companies which aren't performing well to start with, which is the whole nub of the problem, and makes them even more financially weakened by virtue of the fact that valuable resources have been removed.
For some reason, it is very un-American to get a return on investment. It's called, quote, upstreaming. By the unions at Eastern who don't even like to admit the fact that 100% of the shares of the company were bought and a substantial amount of cash was paid for by Texas Air, for which it is yet to receive one nickel's worth of, quote, return on investment.
You got to remember, these people thought they had purchased a 25% equity share in this corporation. Come February of 1986, they found out that they didn't have what they had paid the money for. And they were very upset and bitter.
The unions went to court to protest the managing of the company that they once partially owned. They charged that when Texas Air was not able to bargain for wage cuts, the company began dismantling Eastern in order to force wage concessions. Federal court transcripts in the pending case reveal an internal Eastern document called the Chunks Memo, discussing the psychological impact of selling chunks of the airline. One excerpt cited in the federal court record notes that selling the Eastern shuttle would have maximum impact on the IAM. The unions also charged that Texas Air was trying to shift jobs and assets away from high-wage Eastern to low-wage Continental.
Eastern Airlines reservations, Claudia Russo.
There are 5 major computer reservation systems in the United States. System 1 was Eastern's, and it was vital to the airline's success. It generated cash from booking fees, and travel agents who leased the system favored Eastern when they sold tickets. In 1987, Eastern sold System 1 to Texas Air, and now Eastern pays for the system it used to own.
Management has said that companies that lose money must sell assets to generate liquidity. The computer reservation system was sold in April of 1987. Eastern received a note with a final maturity in the year 2012. Not a penny of cash was paid to Eastern. The market estimates of the value of System 1 were $250 to $350 million. Texas Air paid Eastern $100 million.
System 1 is not in itself a very profitable company. It's not profitable in the year 1988, which also surprises people. What is important for Eastern Airlines is that it gets the benefit of the computerization, and what Texas Air was able to do is substantially increase the computer penetration through travel agents. And in fact, at the time of the acquisition, the penetration was about 12%, and Texas Air has taken that up to over 18%, which of course is very beneficial to Eastern.
Today, more travel agents use System 1, but they now favor both Eastern and Continental. Eastern's unions charge that sharing the system benefits Texas Air and Continental at Eastern's expense.
Someone once asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks, and he said that's where the money is. And I believe that that reality is largely underscores what's happening between the relationship of the holding company and the airlines, particularly the unionized airline. It has become the equivalent of the clunker you might keep in your backyard that's being used for spare parts for your car that you want to park in your garage that all your neighbors can see and out on your driveway. The car in the driveway for all your neighbors to see is Continental Airlines. That is the flagship of Texas Air. That's the way this has been designed. And Eastern has been relegated to being that of a clunker from which spare parts can be derived and value can be stripped and removed.
Critics have pointed to a pattern in some key markets. Eastern would cut back on flights, and Continental would move in to fill the void. For example, in September 1985, before the Texas Air takeover, Eastern flew 28 flights a week on the profitable route between New Orleans and Washington, D.C. Continental did not fly the route. 3 years later, Continental was flying 35 flights a week between New Orleans and Washington, and Eastern had quit the route. From 1986 to 1989, Continental's annual revenues have doubled to $4.6 billion, and Eastern's have been reduced by nearly $1 billion a year.
If Eastern continually has losses, then there's very little incentive for investors to keep investment capital at Eastern and an incentive to move capital out and to liquefy the assets, that's for sure.
The Evergreen Air Center in Arizona. It is a graveyard for Eastern jets awaiting resale or stripped for salvage. As of today, 40 planes have been grounded, sold, or leased. Eastern has retreated from 14 cities. 14,000 jobs have been lost. As 1988 losses approached $400 million, Eastern continued to sell bits and pieces of the airline to make debt payments.
We are, in a way, burning up the furniture to heat the house. But the house is about 20 degrees below zero, and if we don't heat the house, the furniture will be there with a lot of other inanimate objects, and this will be called all the people of Eastern Airlines and the customers of Eastern Airlines, because there won't be Eastern around to run it.
If companies are run on the principle of financial management, reducing wages, going deeply into debt, moving pieces of the company around like they were pieces of a monopoly game, workers are not going to feel loyal. They're going to say to themselves, who are we working for? Why are we working for that company? If this company is nothing but a collection of financial assets, then I don't owe this company any more loyalty than a stockholder does, who moves in and out of large issues at the speed of an electronic impulse.
All 3 unions have joined forces to try to find another buyer for Eastern. They were willing to consider wage cuts, provided the deal included a reconstruction of the old power-sharing accord.
The whole range of things that would make Eastern culture back what it once was in that Camelot period when we actually had 4 people on the board of directors. We were very profitable. The company was very successful.
Give a good grip, sir.
This thing at Eastern we had created was such a perfect model everyone believed in and recognized its value so much that now moving up to Lorenzo wanting to make a deal with the employees involved, there's no trust. They don't trust the process. They don't trust corporate America. They don't trust anybody to ever live up to the commitment and to have the commitment to the quality of life for workers and quality of life for employees, which is what our economy should be all about.
Charlie Bryan goes too far in that he crosses the line between what the role of the management of the company is and indeed what the role of the shareholders and the owners and the investors of the capital are as opposed to employees. You know, it perhaps is the case here that Charlie Bryan has had a taste, having been on the board, he's had a taste of the power structure, and indeed he's had a taste of the nice perquisites that go along with it, including his gold Eastern annual pass, which I understand he doesn't have anymore.
By the end of 1988, Frank Lorenzo still controlled Eastern Airlines, but his freedom to maneuver was limited. The National Mediation Board refused to release Eastern and its unions from mediated wage negotiations. Legally, this meant Lorenzo couldn't cut wages or hire non-union workers. Without a release, Lorenzo felt that he had no choice but to step up the sale of Eastern's assets.
When a patient has cancer and you apply chemotherapy, you don't like the look of some of the symptoms. And unfortunately, while I'm not thrilled with that analogy, the fact is there's a lot there to be learned from.
Lorenzo can't solve Eastern Airlines' problems. I don't think he could from the beginning, and I don't think he can now. The airline business is essentially a service business. In the end, everybody can buy the same airplanes. The real difference airline to airline is the people. It's how they deal with their management, with each other, and most importantly in the end with the flying public. You can't run a service business with the management and the workforce in a state of perpetual warfare.
On October 13th, 1988, Texas Air made a deal to sell the Eastern Shuttle to real estate magnate Donald Trump.
The sale today is not our preferred course. However, we have been deprived of an environment to negotiate the contracts at Eastern, specifically with the IAM.
The valuable shuttle accounted for half of the company's operating profits. Its sale demoralized the unions. It demonstrated that Lorenzo would keep selling pieces of the airline unless the unions gave in.
Selling off good parts of Eastern to hold on to the bad parts of Eastern is exactly what people do when they're in trouble. People who are in trouble always end up selling off the good part of the business and holding the bad. So looking at least that part of the Texas Air empire, one would say that it doesn't augur well for the future.
If the fuel markets turn and we have an economic slowdown and Texas Air doesn't make it, we're going to have a fiasco in this country because 20% of the capacity in this country has been allowed to come under the control of a highly leveraged company, which is embarked in a confrontation between labor and interest cost. It's not labor and management, it's labor and interest cost.
When the dust settles, when the sun sets, there is one big question with which we are left. What, after all, is the meaning and purpose of the American corporation? Is it just a bundle of financial assets to be moved around to their highest and best use? Or is a corporation a network of mutual obligations, mutual responsibilities, a compact between people to produce wealth in the future? Can we have it both ways? The Eastern story suggests no.
Back in '85, I really thought we were going to make it. I mean, we were doing great. We saved millions and millions of dollars, and We had everybody humming. It was like a fine clock. And now the morale out there is pitiful. People hate to come to work here. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop. I would just personally like to see it over with one way or the other, so I can know what to do with my life. You know, I'll go get another job, or I'll do what I have to do. But I hate to go like this way. But I'm not gonna let it wear me down either. I'll be here when they lock the doors.
After 15 months of negotiation, Eastern Airlines and its machinists union have failed to agree on a new contract. Federal mediators insist the parties keep talking. Reportedly, the mediators are not convinced Eastern is bargaining in good faith with the union. Thank you for joining us. I'm Judy Woodruff. Good night.
The big surprise of the 1988 presidential race was the phenomenal campaign of Jesse Jackson.
We the people can win.
Inside the campaign, it was hope and hype driving the Jackson caravan.